So, as we've been saying this evening, there's a lot in this parsha. Parshat Noach is about destruction and survival. It's about extreme reactions to evil, about the continuum of righteousness, and of course about the covenant of the rainbow. It's a story in some ways about the ultimate act of divine overreaction, and I believe divine regret. What happened after to the descendants of Noah, to those who survived the flood and repopulated the earth, relying on that covenant of the rainbow, relying on God's promise that God would never again destroy the earth? What does it do to people who remember when the earth was destroyed? What does it do to people who have inherited the trauma of those who watched, perhaps from the windows of the ark? In her powerful Dvar Torah this week called Staying Afloat in a World of Loss, Rabbi Aviva Richman of Yeshivat Hadar writes, "The scope of the utter destruction of life in the flood is overwhelming. It's related repeatedly. All creatures breathed their last breath. Everything alive died. All existence was erased." Each verse turns the wrench deeper into a sense of loss on an unimaginable scale, she writes. Living through COVID over the past year and a half and witnessing recent devastation from climate crisis, the chilling description resonates too close to home as we've confronted loss on a scale unknown in most lifetimes. For those of us who lived through it, it recalled the days of AIDS, and some powerful essays in the last year and a half have come out talking about the lessons the LGBT communities learned from AIDS that carried us through this time, but also of the profound trauma that it reawakened. Rabbi Richman continues, "The words read more like a eulogy and less like an unrelatable epic. Sheltering as best we can, we grieve like Noah must have grieved in the ark. The flood story articulates an enormous public and shared loss." The covenant of the rainbow comes relatively early in this parsha, but that isn't to say that all of the hard times are in the past. This parsha cycles through other narratives of loss, ending with the story of Avram and Sarai's infertility, which is actually the focus of Rabbi Richman's Dvar Torah, which I really recommend reading if you want, and including the story of the Tower of Babel, the story of a very different kind of loss. After the flood, the Torah tells us, "Vayehi chol haaretz safa achat udvarim achadim." Everyone on earth had the same language. They spoke the same language and the same words. The rabbis explain that dvarim achadim, the same words or few words, means that they all agreed with each other. It was a generation of consensus. And the upside of this, explains Rashi, the commentator, is that if someone had an idea, everyone got behind it and they made it happen. There was no debate. I have to admit that part of me reading this now finds something really appealing about a society where everyone can communicate really easily with each other, where everyone speaks the same language, everybody agrees, life is not categorized or qualified by discord or dissent. The downside was they had very few ideas. And the ones they had were not so great. And dissent, says the Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, was often flattened in that culture. Wiser instincts, which are often fewer, were totally diluted and shot down by the mob majority. So in this story, of course, their one big idea was to build a city with a tower that would be so tall that its head would be in the heavens. And they said, "Come, let us build us a city and a tower with its top in the sky to make a name for ourselves, else we shall be scattered all over the world." The Radak, drawing from Midrash Rabbah, explains that Noach and his family, who were somehow still part of the equation, understood that God wanted humanity to spread out and repopulate to settle the earth. And they understood that because they saw that the population was increasing, and they understood the inadequacy of the environment in which they lived at the time. They knew that a plan to settle all of humankind in one single irrigated valley was not going to work in the long term. It was not a sustainable solution. But even though they understood that, they went along with the majority opinion of the time to preserve the positive values of unity and the common language among all of humanity. And so they went along with the plan that even then they understood to be idolatrous in its inception, to build this tower. Because in building the tower, the people were challenging God. You're only giving us earth. We want heaven too. We want it all. And so we're going to build a tower so high that we can get up there, that we can stake our claim. You can't tell us where we can live. You can't tell us what we can do. We are in charge of the earth, and we're going to use it however we want to. Some commentators put it even more bluntly and say that what they were trying to do was wage war against God. What were they doing? Was that really everything that they were trying to accomplish? Was it about challenging God's sovereignty? I think there's another way to read this. If we look at that verse again, "Come, let us build a city, a tower with its top in the sky to make our name for ourselves, else we shall be scattered all over the world." This is the kind of faulty decision-making that comes from acting out of trauma and that comes from squashing dissent. The people are scared. What if God is planning to try to destroy them again? What if they are sitting ducks to plague or war or flood? So they build a wall. They build a tower. They circle the wagons. They close out everything around them. But of course, like them, we have learned the hard way that building cities cannot protect us from natural disaster or from plague. That a few loud, over-resourced voices trying to reach the heavens is not really what this under-resourced world needs. That assuming that building huge monuments to commerce and power is not what will sustain this fragile earth. The people hoped that in building the city and the tower, they would feel safe, they would feel powerful, that if they ever traveled, they would feel proud of their hometown, and they would always come home. It was almost like that tower was going to be a psychological and physical magnet to pull them home all the time. But of course, that divine instinct to agree, to be unified, to gather, was really hunkering down and hiding. It was silencing dissent. And of course, only a few verses later, we read that God says, "Let's go down and confound their speech there, so they will not understand one another's speech." This time, God didn't destroy the people using physical might, using natural disaster. God didn't even physically scatter them far from each other, but by mixing up their languages, the people themselves started moving away from one another. They couldn't understand each other. They couldn't keep building this project. It fell apart. And so they abandoned it. They couldn't talk to each other. There are so many people that I can't talk to anymore. And it's really, really sad. Every time something big is going on, each election, each war in Gaza, it feels like the circle of people I can talk to gets smaller. And we have that instinct to turn off the voices we can't bear to listen to, the fights that have gotten too ugly. Somehow, our discourse today can have the worst features of pre-Tower of Babel and of Tower of Babel. No one understands each other. Collaboration to solve global problems is extremely hard. And at the same time, platforms like social media flatten the distinctions between wisdom and destructive chatter. Everyone can have an equally loud voice, and discerning what is real can sometimes be very hard. So COVID deniers are as loud as scientists. There's no common language. It's like tohu vavohu, the divine mush, the confusion, the chaos that preceded creation. This generation is called Dor HaFlaga, the generation of dispersal. It was such a transformational moment that they went from all being together in that place to dispersed around the world. That dispersal is what characterized the generation. So my question is, was that dispersal a punishment, or was it a challenge? Right? This week there was an afternoon where Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp all went down. Maybe for some of us the most productive afternoon we'd had in a very long time. And for some of us, the loneliest. We had to reach out in other ways. We had to use other modalities of language. We had to read our news from actual news sources. We had to talk to each other. For some people, those hours were terrifying. We wondered what it would be like if we communicated in completely different ways. And then we went back. But in some ways, we are very much another generation of haflaga, of dispersal. And actually, the diversity of speech is a profound blessing. Actually, it's another kind of rainbow. It's often framed as a punishment, this dispersal. But I think it's a way of lifting up diverse voices. If there's one loud voice all the time, so loud the difference can't be heard above the din, it's like taking all of the paint colors and mushing them up into some kind of muddy muck where you can't remember that each distinct hue is beautiful and special. So in some ways, the separation was like holding a prism to light to bring out the distinct shades of the rainbow, to lift each voice out of that muck so each one of them can sing. So we, this generation of another dispersal, can see it as a challenge, to lift the voices, to discern each color of that rainbow, and to sing out our difference, our respect, and our blessing. Shabbat Shalom.